Section 1. The nature of the void. There is something that lives in the dark corners of the Imperium that no one talks about. Not because it is forbidden, not because it is classified, though it is that too. People simply don't talk about it, because to talk about it means you have to remember it exists. And remembering that it exists means your mind has to sit with the wrongness of it, the deep, bone-level discomfort that every single person in the 41st millennium feels when they think about what a Culexus assassin actually is. Not what it does, not where it comes from, what it is. Because most things that kill you in the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, at least, have a soul. Space Marines blaze with the light of the Emperor's will and the genetic fury of their Primarch. Chaos champions carry the mark of their patron gods, corrupt and corrosive but undeniably present, burning like infected stars in the sea of the warp. Even the lowliest guardsman, a frightened 18-year-old standing in a trench somewhere on a planet he cannot name, carries within him a tiny, flickering soul light that every psyker could detect if they reached out with their mind. It might be barely brighter than a candle, but it is there. A Culexus assassin has nothing. Not a dim soul, not a corrupted soul, not even the soul of something long dead. When you look at a Culexus assassin through the warp, through the vast sea of dreams and screams and psychic energy that underlies all of reality, you don't see a faint shape or a dark silhouette. You see a whole, an absolute, perfect, suffocating void where a person should be. And that void reaches out. It pulls at the things around it. It is not passive. It is not just an absence. It is an anti-presence, an active negation of everything that the warp is and everything that a living soul represents, and it presses against the minds of everyone nearby with the cold, horrible weight of deep ocean water. Normal humans feel uneasy. They feel instinctively that something is wrong. They feel a sudden, inexplicable desire to be somewhere else, anywhere else, without quite knowing why. Experienced soldiers find their hands shaking. Crowds part before a Culexus without being asked. Children cry. Dogs run. Psychers don't just feel uneasy. Psychers suffer. Because a psycher's entire life is built around their connection to the immaterium, the warp is where their power comes from, where their sight reaches, where their mind has always stretched like an extra hand into another dimension. And when a Culexus walks near a psycher, that connection doesn't just weaken, it tears. It sputters and collapses like a fire that has suddenly been dropped into the bottom of the ocean, and the psyker feels it happening, feels their gift being ripped away, and the sensation is apparently indescribable. Former targets who survived encounters with Culexus operatives, which is not many, described it later as feeling as though they were being unmade from the inside, as though the part of themselves that made them who they were was simply being erased. This is what the Culexus Temple of the Officio Assassinorum has taken, has trained, has refined over 10,000 years of the Imperium's long and blood-soaked history, and turned into the single most specialized killing instrument in all of human civilization. They are not the biggest, they are not the strongest, they are not the most numerous or the most versatile, but they are, without any question or competition, the rarest. And in certain situations, against certain targets, there is no other answer. There is nothing else that works. Tonight, we are going deep into the lore of the Culexus assassins. We are going to follow their origins back to the shadow years of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium was young, and the idea of using people like this as weapons was so controversial, it nearly got them all killed before they ever became what they are. We are going to look at the pariah gene itself, at what it means to carry it, at the lonely and terrible life of someone born without a soul in a universe where having one is the baseline expectation of existence. We are going to examine the fortress of the soulless, the training, the war gear, the kills, the famous operations, and the broader implications of what these people represent in the lore of 40,000. This is going to be a long one. Get comfortable. Because there is nothing quite like the Culexus in any fiction, anywhere, and the full story of who they are and what they cost the galaxy deserves to be told properly. One thing that makes the Culexus uniquely compelling as a subject, before we even begin the history and the lore, is the way they invert the usual logic of what makes something scary in the 40,000 universe. The setting is not shy about its monsters. Tyranids eat worlds. Orcs fight with infectious, almost comedic enthusiasm across entire star systems. Chaos Marines have been warped by 10,000 years of service to the dark gods into something that only barely resembles the noble warriors they once were. These are threats defined by presence, by excess, by the overwhelming, violent, aggressive assertion of their own existence against the existence of everything around them. The Culexus is defined by absence. And absence, it turns out, can be more frightening than presence when you understand what is absent and what that absence means. A chaos sorcerer who has spent decades building their power, who has bartered pieces of their soul away to the ruinous powers for gifts of psychic ability that make them functionally untouchable by conventional military force, suddenly facing someone who makes all of that irrelevant simply by existing in the same physical space, that is a kind of horror that does not roar. It does not claw. It just walks forward, in the silence left by everything you used to be able to do, and it comes for you in a quiet that feels like the end of everything. That is the Culexus. That is what we are here to understand. And the more completely you understand it, the more the rest of the 40,000 universe shifts in its light. Because the Culexus and what they represent is not a corner case, not an oddity tucked away in a footnote of the lore. It is a mirror held up to everything the Imperium is and everything it costs to be part of it. Section 2. The Pariah Gene. Born without a soul. Before we can talk about what the Culexus Temple does or how it does it, we need to sit with the Pariah Gene itself. Because the gene is not just a recruitment prerequisite, it is the entire foundation upon which everything about the Culexus is built. Every piece of their war gear, every tactic they use, every reason they exist at all, traces back to this one genetic mutation that appears in the human population at the rate of roughly one individual in a billion, or possibly even rarer. That number deserves a moment. 1 in a billion. The Imperium of mankind governs, at its peak, something in the vicinity of 1 million inhabited worlds, with a total human population measured in the hundreds of trillions. That sounds like it should produce a lot of pariahs, but consider what 1 billion actually is. If you stood in a crowd of 1 billion people, it would take a shape roughly equivalent to the population of Earth as it exists today. And, somewhere in that entire crowd, exactly one person would carry the pariah gene in a strong enough form to matter. One person whose absence from the warp is so total and so pronounced that other people can feel it, even if they cannot name what they are feeling. Now imagine trying to find that person. The pariah gene, also called the blanks gene or informally the null gene, produces what the lore refers to as a psychic blank, an untouchable, a null, a pariah. All of these terms describe the same thing. A human being whose presence in the immaterium is not merely absent, but actively negative, where every other living creature casts some kind of shadow in the warp, some mirror of their consciousness and soul in that parallel dimension of thought and emotion and raw psychic energy. A blank casts nothing. Worse than nothing, they cast an anti-shadow. Their existence in real space corresponds to a void in the warp, a bubble of complete psychic silence that grows larger and more suffocating the stronger the blank's gene expression happens to be. The scale of this effect is classified in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, using what is called the assignment, the same system used to grade psychers from Zeta at the lower end, up through Epsilon, Delta, Gamma, Beta, and Alpha at the top. Most sanctioned psychers fall somewhere in the Epsilon to Delta range. Truly dangerous, truly powerful psychers begin to appear in the Beta and Alpha categories, and blanks occupy the nethermost end of the same scale, from Phi+ at the weakest end down to the extraordinarily rare Omega- grade, which describes someone whose null aura is so profound and so active that even non-psychers within range experience significant psychological distress just from proximity. Most pariahs fall somewhere in the middle of that negative range. Their effect on people around them is real but manageable. They make people uncomfortable. They struggle socially, profoundly, and consistently, because the discomfort they generate is not something anyone can consciously control or overcome with willpower. It is baked into the biology of how human brains interact with the warp. And because the warp is so fundamental to the fabric of consciousness itself, a blank feels wrong in a way that goes straight past rational thought and speaks directly to something ancient and instinctive in the human nervous system. People avoid them. Even people who know what a blank is, who understand intellectually that the person in front of them is human and harmless, still feel that wrongness pressing at the back of their mind and find themselves edging away from it. Imagine living with that every day. Blanks, as a result, typically have profoundly isolated childhoods. Parents who do not know what the pariah gene is, which is most of them, simply feel an instinctive wrongness about their child that they cannot explain and cannot suppress. They might love the child, sincerely and genuinely, but something in the way the universe works makes their affection curdle at the edges. Friends drift away without knowing why. Teachers feel vaguely hostile without understanding the source of their hostility. Entire communities can develop a kind of low-grade, collective unease around a single, blank child that eventually crystallizes into folklore and superstition. Stories about the child who brings bad luck, the teenager who makes animals nervous, the young adult who has never quite seemed like everyone else. On many worlds throughout the Imperium, this folklore has become codified into cultural practice. Communities will refuse to touch blanks. Some cultures believe that physical contact with a null will strip your own soul away over time. Others describe them as the living dead, walking corpses whose hearts still beat, but whose inner light has been extinguished. There are planets recorded in imperial archives where the discovery of a blank child within a community has led to exile, to imprisonment, to execution, all carried out by ordinary people who had no real understanding of what they were doing or why. Only the bone-deep certainty that this person did not belong among them. The lore makes clear that most pariahs who do not get picked up by the Culexus Temple, the Inquisition, or some other arm of the Imperium that knows what to do with them simply do not live very long. They end up on the fringes of society, in the wilderness, in remote places where they can minimize their contact with others and the others' contact with them. And even then, the universe has a way of finding them, because in the 41st millennium, the universe is not kind to the alone and the unprotected. Before we even reach the question of origin, though, there is something worth dwelling on: the psychological texture of being a blank. Because the lore tends to describe the pariah gene through its effects on others, through the discomfort and panic and pain it generates in the people nearby, and in doing so, it often treats the blank themselves as a kind of force of nature rather than a person. But the blank is a person, and everything that their null aura does to the people around them, everything that radiates outward and disrupts and disturbs, those same people also live inside their own awareness and feel the results of what they are. There is a phenomenon, documented in various imperial records related to blanks and untouchables, that might be called the feedback problem. Because the null aura generates discomfort in others, and those others react to that discomfort with unconscious withdrawal, hostility, avoidance, the blank receives back a constant stream of social rejection that has nothing to do with anything they have done or said. From the very beginning of their awareness, as children, they absorb the experience of being instinctively shunned by the people around them. The parents who cannot quite bring themselves to hold them as comfortably as they hold other children. The siblings who drift away without explaining why. The teachers who are consistently shorter with them than with other students, who grade them harder, who call on them less. All of this shapes a psychology. A blank raised in normal human society, which is to say, almost every naturally born pariah who has not been found and collected by the Culexus or the Inquisition early, develops a relationship to social interaction that is necessarily different from what non-blanks develop. Some become extraordinarily self-contained, finding ways to exist that minimize their need for social connection, because social connection, for them, is a source of constant pain rather than comfort. Some develop elaborate coping strategies, ways of managing the discomfort they generate in others through physical distance, through behavioral adaptation, through an exhausting, constant awareness of how they are affecting the people around them and how to minimize that effect as much as possible. Some, and this is perhaps the saddest category in the lore, try desperately and repeatedly to form the connections that everyone around them seems to form so easily, and fail again, and never fully understand why. Because the wrongness the blank generates is below conscious perception in most people. It is not experienced as hatred or as considered rejection. It is experienced as unease, as a vague sense that something about this person is not right. And because it is vague, because it cannot be articulated or pointed to, the people who feel it cannot explain it to the blank, cannot provide any feedback that would allow the blank to understand or address what is happening. The blank simply experiences being unsuccessful at relationships, repeatedly, without ever being given the reason. This is the raw material the Culexus temple works with. Not trained killers looking for purpose, not warriors seeking a cause. People who have been shaped by a lifetime of inexplicable rejection into individuals who are, in many ways, unusually well-equipped for a particular kind of isolation and a particular kind of cold, purposive focus. People who have learned, because they had to learn, to operate without the emotional scaffolding that most humans depend upon without thinking about it. The origins of the gene itself are genuinely debated within the lore, and this is one of those places where the 40,000 setting earns its reputation for layered, meaningful ambiguity rather than cheap mystery. There are several competing theories, and none of them are entirely confirmed or entirely disproven. One theory, now largely considered outdated and potentially retconned out of the current canon, held that the pariah gene was created deliberately by the Cetan, known as the Deceiver, one of the ancient star gods of the Necrons, as part of a long-term strategy to erode the Old One's psychic advantage during the War in Heaven, a conflict so ancient it predates the rise of humanity. The idea was that by seeding the human gene pool with a mutation that produced individuals completely disconnected from the warp, the Deceiver was preparing a biological weapon against psychers and warp-dependent entities that could be deployed thousands of years later, when humanity had spread enough to make it meaningful. This theory is interesting for what it implies about the Necrons and their relationship to the blank phenomenon, and it does connect to other lore about the pariah, nexus, and Necron interest in blanks, but as a definitive origin, it has largely fallen out of favor. The more current theories are somewhat more grounded. One holds that the pariah gene is a natural, if incredibly rare, evolutionary adaptation, the universe pushing back against itself in the form of individual humans who are, at a genetic level, resistant to the warp's corrupting influence. In a setting where the warp is constantly bleeding into reality, where demonic possession and psychic corruption are genuine existential threats to any sufficiently large population, there is a certain brutal evolutionary logic to the idea that occasionally a person is born so thoroughly insulated from the warp that they cannot be reached or corrupted by it at all. They are nature's firebreak, the galaxy's antibody. Another theory, and this one has some official support, is that the gene is a remnant of deliberate biological engineering carried out during the dark age of technology, the pre-imperial age of rampant scientific ambition and catastrophic hubris that created many of the stranger elements of the 40,000 universe. The idea is that some civilization or faction during that lost era deliberately engineered a null gene as a potential weapon or as a protective measure, then introduced it into the human gene pool in a way that would ensure it persisted even across the collapse of civilization and the 10,000-year dark age that followed. If this is true, then every blank is, in some sense, the lingering footprint of an ancestor they will never know, born into a purpose they may never understand, carrying a legacy that was encoded into the deepest levels of their being before recorded history. It is worth pausing on the evolutionary adaptation theory for a moment, because it is the one that carries the most interesting implications for the broader 40,000 universe and for what it suggests about the relationship between humanity and the warp. The setting's foundational premise is that humanity is caught between two enormous existential forces: the chaos gods, who feed on human emotion and whose power grows with the rising psychic potential of the species, and the physical universe, which is being consumed by those same gods through their influence on everything from individual corruption to galaxy-scale cataclysms. Humanity's psychic awakening, the slow but accelerating increase in the number of human psychers across the millennia, is simultaneously humanity's greatest potential strength and the primary mechanism by which the chaos gods grow more powerful. A natural counter to this, an evolutionary pressure that produces individuals who are entirely cut off from the warp and who actively suppress it in their vicinity, would represent the universe pushing back against its own corruption in the form of a biological solution. Evolution working in real time against a threat that is itself operating in something other than conventional physical time. If the pariah gene is this, if it is the species itself trying to correct an existential imbalance by occasionally producing individuals who stand on the other side of the equation from psychers, then the Culexus Temple's use of these individuals becomes something stranger and more significant than a mere weapons program. It becomes a kind of harnessing of biology's own self-defense mechanism, a partnership between institutional design and deep evolutionary necessity. The question of whether the Emperor understood this, whether any part of his long-term plan for humanity involved the deliberate cultivation of blank capability as a counter to the psychic threat that he foresaw growing with his species' development, is something the lore raises without ever fully answering. The Emperor's plans are intentionally opaque in the setting, but the fact that he did not prevent Malcador from building the Culexus clade, that he permitted this program to exist and to grow, even when powerful factions in his own government wanted it destroyed, suggests, at minimum, that he saw value in it that transcended the immediate tactical utility of having operatives who could kill psychers. What is certain, regardless of origin, is that the gene is heritable. A blank is significantly more likely to produce blank children than a non-blank. This has implications for the Culexus Temple's approach to recruiting, which we will come back to. It also means that certain populations, certain isolated communities and family lines, carry a higher concentration of blank births than the galactic average. The feral populations of certain worlds, particularly those with long histories of isolation and inbreeding, are noted in imperial records as producing blanks at a higher rate than more cosmopolitan populations, presumably because a null gene introduced into an isolated gene pool has had fewer diluting generations to work against it. At its most extreme expression, the omega- grade, the pariah gene, produces something genuinely terrifying. An omega- blank does not merely suppress psychic ability. Their very presence begins to actively damage the mental and spiritual integrity of anyone nearby. Psychers do not just lose access to their powers. They experience pain, genuine physical pain, as the connection between their consciousness and the warp is forcibly severed by the proximity to something that should not exist. Long exposure can cause psychic burnout. Very close proximity can kill. And even for non-psychers, an omega- blank's aura presses so heavily on the human nervous system that people experience symptoms resembling panic attacks, depersonalization, the feeling that reality itself is somehow wrong, that the light is too sharp, that sounds are too loud, that every familiar thing has become slightly alien. This is what the Culexus Temple takes and trains. This is what they point at the enemies of the Emperor. And the only question that remains before we tell the story of how that temple came to exist is whether you would call what they do with these people salvation, or whether you would call it something considerably darker. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a great time to do that. The button is right there, it costs you nothing, and it means a great deal. Section 3. Origins of the Culexus Temple, the secret within secrets. The Culexus Temple as an institution is ancient. It predates the Horus heresy. It predates the formal structure of the Officio Assassinorum as most people understand it. In fact, the story of how the Culexus came to exist is one of those pieces of 40,000 lore that rewards careful reading, because it involves conspiracy within conspiracy, bureaucratic warfare disguised as religious piety, and the kind of cold pragmatism that runs like a vein of iron through everything Malcador, the Sigillite, ever touched. To understand the origins of the Culexus, you need to understand the political climate of the early Great Crusade. The Emperor of Mankind had begun his push to reunite the scattered human worlds of the galaxy. The Legiones Astartes were being forged and deployed, world after world was being brought into compliance, and the early administrative structure of what would become the Imperium was taking shape on Terra, in the form of the Council of Terra. And part of what this council was doing, part of what any large centralizing political body does in its early stages, is deciding who belongs and who does not, who gets protection and who gets classified as a threat. Psychers were one of the first great political battles of the early Imperium. The Emperor himself was a psycher of incomprehensible power. The Primarchs, his sons, many of them possessed psychic gifts. The librarians of the legions drew on the warp. The navigators who guided the fleet through warp space were mutants, whose third eye was an act of biology intertwined with the Imperium. Psykers were simultaneously among the most useful and the most feared individuals in existence. The Council of Terra was filled with people on both sides of this debate, those who wanted Psykers embraced and regulated, and those who wanted them hunted and destroyed. Into this already tense political environment walked the Sisters of Silence, bringing with them something that neither side had quite expected: blanks. The Silent Sisterhood, that all-female order of psychic nulls who served the Adeptus, Astra, Telepathica, and the Emperor himself, had been traveling through the stars in the wake of the Great Crusade, performing one of their most important functions. They hunted rogue psykers, certainly, but they also gathered psychic blanks wherever they found them. And as the Great Crusade expanded, they found them in greater and greater numbers, simply because they were traveling to more worlds and encountering more human populations than had ever been surveyed before. When these blanks began to arrive on Terra in significant numbers, grouped together for transport and processing, something unexpected happened. The combined null aura of multiple blanks in close proximity began to interfere with the Astronomicon, that vast psychic beacon powered by the Emperor himself that guided every navigator's ship through the warp across the breadth of the Imperium. Groups of blanks, concentrated in one place, cast a psychic shadow so deep that nearby portions of the Astronomicon's beam were disrupted. Navigators complained, trade routes were affected, military logistics were disrupted. This was the moment when the political situation tipped from uneasy to genuinely dangerous. Factions within the Council of Terra, including the powerful Navis Nobilite, the ancient navigator families whose monopoly on warp travel gave them enormous political leverage, began pushing the Emperor to treat blanks the way the most zealous imperial institutions treated other dangerous mutants: exterminate them. The argument was framed in the language of practical necessity. The Astronomicon must not be compromised. Blanks compromise it by their very presence. Therefore, blanks must be removed. It was the kind of logic that sounds reasonable, right up until you interrogate its consequences, which were the systematic murder of every person born with a particular genetic trait across 1,000,000 worlds. The Sisters of Silence were given the task of killing them. The same organization that had been gathering and protecting blanks was now, under political pressure, being redirected toward their destruction. But this is where it gets interesting, because Malcador the Sigillite had been watching this entire debate unfold, and Malcador the Sigillite was not the kind of man who wasted potential. Malcador, the regent of Terra, the Emperor's right hand, the most politically powerful human in the galaxy below the Emperor himself, had been working for some time with the Magos Biologes and the Genitors of the ancient Mechanicum. They had been quietly, secretly, carefully researching whether the pariah gene could be weaponized, whether the null aura that made blanks so socially catastrophic could be enhanced, focused, trained, and turned into something the Imperium could use as an instrument of targeted killing. The project was called, in the fragmented Imperial records that survive from this period, the Pariah Project. The project was almost complete. Decades of research had produced results. The theory was sound. The early test operatives were showing genuine promise. And now, the Council of Terra's political panic was threatening to have every viable candidate executed before the program could ever be fully realized. Malcador moved. What happened publicly was this. The Mechanicum announced that the Pariah Project had been ended. The laboratories were closed. The test subjects were executed. There was appropriate ceremony around it. The right people were informed through the right channels, and the most zealous members of the Council were satisfied that the potential threat had been neutralized. What actually happened was somewhat different. Working under a veil of secrecy so complete that even highly classified imperial records from this period contain gaps that historians have never been able to fully reconstruct, the Mechanicum quietly moved the most promising blank test subjects from the visible laboratories to a specially constructed facility on Terra, built in a location so isolated and so thoroughly concealed that it lay beyond the awareness of any branch of what would eventually become the Adeptus Terra. The Sisters of Silence, whose numbers of executed blanks were carefully checked against the number who had been in the laboratories, found that the math did not quite add up. Some blanks had apparently been missed. The records showed otherwise, but reality disagreed. It was in this hidden facility that the Culexus clade, which would eventually become the Culexus Temple, took its present form. The man who built it, the first director primus of the organization, is known in the surviving lore only as Sire Culexus. His real name has not survived, or if it has, it is held in archives so restricted that no source accessible even to most inquisitors can retrieve it. What is known is that he was himself a blank, presumably a particularly powerful one, and that he was the first person to truly understand, in a systematic and operational way, how the pariah gene could be transformed from a social catastrophe into a precision killing instrument. Sire Culexus was present on Mount Vengeance, one of the earliest gathering places of the Officio Assassinorum's founding figures. There, alongside the founders of the other assassination clades that would eventually become the Vindicare, the Calidus, the Eversor, and the others, he swore an oath in the company of Malcador, the Sigillite. It was the oath that defined the Officio Assassinorum as an institution. The oath that promised no enemy of the Emperor would find safety or shelter anywhere in the galaxy. The oath that created, in the moment of its speaking, the idea that there existed individuals so utterly committed to the Emperor's cause that they would operate beyond the reach of conventional law, beyond the normal structures of war and politics, to reach into whatever darkness sheltered the enemies of mankind and pull them out into the light, or more accurately, pull the light from them permanently. The Culexus clade's particular promise was this: they would hunt the psychically gifted, unsanctioned psychers, rogue witches, Xenos warlocks, chaos sorcerers, anything that wielded the warp as a weapon against the Imperium. They would hunt these targets specifically because they were the targets no one else could reliably reach. A Vindicare could shoot a Chaos Space Marine warlord from 6 kilometers away in a hurricane with a precision that defied physics. But an alpha-level psyker, surrounded by psychic wards and demonic servitors, whose precognition let them see bullets before they were fired, who could reach into an assassin's mind and simply stop it? That was a target that required a completely different approach. The Culexus approach was not to shoot faster or to use better wards. The Culexus approach was to simply walk up to the target and let their own existence do most of the work before any physical weapon was ever drawn. Over the millennia, the Culexus clade evolved. Its methods were refined. Its wargear was developed with contributions from some of the finest minds in the Mechanicum, working on projects whose existence was never formally acknowledged. Its training protocols grew increasingly sophisticated because it turned out that possessing the pariah gene was only the beginning. A blank with no training was a social problem and a potentially useful tool. A blank with a century of carefully designed mental conditioning, physical enhancement, and psychological refinement was something altogether different. After the Horus Heresy, when the structure of the Imperium was formalized into the Adeptus Terra, the Culexus clade became officially the Culexus Temple, one of the 4 major orders of the Officio Assassinorum. The fact of its existence remained extraordinarily secret, far more so than the other temples. The Vindicare were whispered about in the halls of power as the ultimate snipers. The Calidus were feared for their shape-shifting infiltrations. The Eversor were known, in the most general terms, as the Imperium's berserker weapon of last resort. But the Culexus, even among people who knew the Officio Assassinorum existed, were spoken of with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of institutional secrecy, though that was certainly there. The silence of something that nobody really wants to think about too hard. Because the other assassin temples were tools built from extraordinary humans. The Culexus Temple was built from people who might not, by some definitions, be entirely human at all. Section 4. The Fortress of the Soulless, where the soulless are made. Every organization leaves traces of its culture in the places it builds for itself. The architecture tells you what the people inside value. It tells you how they see themselves, what they fear, what they aspire to. The headquarters of the Culexus Temple is called the Fortress of the Soulless. The name alone tells you something. It is not located on Terra, which is where most of the great institutions of the Imperium maintain at least some formal presence. It is not on Mars, which hosts the great forges and research facilities of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It sits on a dead moon, in the far reaches of a galaxy that contains 1 trillion places to hide, at a distance from the Astronomicon so great that its psychic light, the beacon that guides every ship through the warp, barely reaches where the fortress stands. The location is officially classified to a level that places it beyond the clearance of most Inquisitors, beyond the reach of most High Lords of Terra, and far, far beyond anything that any ordinary Imperial citizen would ever be permitted to know. The decision to put it there was deliberate, and it reflects multiple overlapping concerns that reveal a great deal about the Culexus Temple's relationship to the rest of the Imperium. First, there is the practical consideration. A large number of powerful blanks, concentrated in one place, creates a psychic shadow of enormous proportions. On Terra, or near the Astronomicon, that shadow would be a genuine navigational hazard, potentially disruptive to the very infrastructure that keeps the Imperium connected. By placing the fortress on a distant dead moon outside the Astronomicon's effective range, the Culexus Temple ensures that its very existence does not accidentally compromise the infrastructure of the civilization it serves. Second, and perhaps more importantly, there is the political consideration. The Culexus Temple has enemies within the Imperium, not external enemies, not Xenos or Chaos forces, but internal ones. There have always been factions within the structures of Imperial power that are deeply uncomfortable with what the Culexus represents. Psyker-reliant institutions like the Novice Nobilite and certain branches of the Inquisition have at various points in the Imperium's history pushed for the Culexus to be regulated more heavily, restricted in scope, or outright dismantled. The Adeptus Mechanicus had its own complicated relationship with the fortress, with records indicating that sometime after the 37th millennium, the Mechanicum attempted to claim ownership of a Culexus facility on Terra on the basis of historical construction rights, a claim that was ended with a sniper's bullet in a manner that made very clear the Officio Assassinorum does not recognize property disputes as a valid form of institutional dialogue. By being distant, by being hard to reach, by sitting in a part of space where people do not go, the Fortress of the Soulless exists in a state of practical autonomy that its inhabitants could not enjoy if they were closer to the centers of imperial power and the political factions that would prefer to have them under tighter oversight. The Culexus Temple differs from the other major assassin orders in one particularly important way. Most of the other temples operate with a degree of internal autonomy. Older, more experienced Lord Assassins manage day-to-day operations, oversee training programs, and sometimes make mission assignation decisions. The relationship between the temples and the wider Officio Assassinorum is one of partnership, or at least of structured delegation. The Culexus Temple is ruled directly by high-ranking officials of the Officio Assassinorum. There is no equivalent of a Lord Assassin managing things at arm's length. The Director Primus of the Culexus is not chosen from within the temple's own ranks in the way that leaders of other temples might be. Control is held tightly, carefully, from outside the organization. This is not an accident. It reflects the same fundamental truth that defines every aspect of how the Imperium deals with blanks. They are enormously valuable. They are also profoundly unnerving to everyone around them, up to and including the people who run the organization built around them, and so the decision was made long ago to keep the oversight direct, to keep the human hierarchy outside the null aura as much as possible, to ensure that the people making the decisions about Culexus deployment are not the people who have spent decades exposed to the oppressive, psychic silence of the fortress itself. All blanks and all Culexus assassins are kept within the fortress unless they are on active duty. This is not presented in the lore with any particular warmth or comfort. They are not kept there because the fortress is pleasant or because the Culexus enjoy living there. They are kept there because the Imperium genuinely does not know what else to do with them. Blanks in public spaces cause problems. They disrupt communities, alarm people, affect the people around them in ways that create administrative and social headaches that the Imperium, characteristically, prefers to solve by removing the source of the problem from public view. The fortress itself is described in the available lore as an echoing, armor-clad fastness that lies always beneath a suffocating blanket of dread. There is no sunlight, presumably, because the moon is dead. There is no warmth, not in the emotional sense, and if we are being realistic, probably not much in the physical sense either. The people who staff the fortress, the custodians and tech priests and administrators who handle logistics and maintenance, are presumably selected for their psychological resilience, for their ability to function in an environment that, by its very nature, makes them feel as though the universe has become slightly wrong. The longer someone spends in close proximity to a large number of powerful blanks, the more that feeling of wrongness accumulates. There is a record in some sources of the sentiment expressed by an inquisitor who worked closely with a Culexus operative over an extended campaign. The quote is, essentially, that the Culexus was an unparalleled killer who fought with a ferocity that demanded both envy and admiration, but that the replacement rate for the acolytes assigned to watch over the operative was regrettably high. Because the experience of watching over a Culexus, of being near one for extended periods, eventually becomes more than most people can manage. They don't go violently mad, at least not usually. They simply become unable to function in close proximity. The wrongness accumulates until it crowds out everything else. The training regime within the fortress is never described in detail in any publicly available lore, which is exactly what you would expect from an organization with the Culexus Temple's level of operational security. What we can piece together from scattered references and in-universe sources is that it is extremely long, extremely demanding, and unusually psychological in its orientation, compared to the physical and tactical training emphasis of the other assassin temples. A Culexus recruit already possesses their primary weapon. Their null aura is there the day they are born, or more accurately, the day they are decanted from the vat growth tanks, since a significant proportion of Culexus operatives are not found in the natural population at all, but are laboriously grown from genetic material in the Culexus Temple's own facilities. This process, the vat growing of pariahs, is noted as being extraordinarily complex and producing only a small number of viable candidates each year, which is itself a hint at why the Culexus is perpetually short of personnel relative to demand. Growing a human being from scratch in a laboratory is difficult. Growing a human being from scratch who carries the pariah gene in a strong enough expression to be useful and who survives the full development process without any of the dozens of things that can go wrong during gestation is considerably more difficult. What training does for these individuals is not teach them a new capability. It teaches them to use the capability they already have, to understand it, to control it, to deploy it with precision rather than simply radiating it indiscriminately. A blank with no training walks into a room and makes everyone uncomfortable. A fully trained Culexus operative walks into a room and makes everyone uncomfortable in exactly the ways and to exactly the degrees that are operationally useful, while concealing the worst of their presence behind the animus speculum's dampening systems until the moment of maximum effect. The training also includes the standard elements you would expect from any serious assassin program. Physical conditioning, which, given the biological enhancements that come with the Culexus war gear, reaches levels that would seem superhuman by baseline standards. Mental conditioning, which in this case has a particular urgency, because a blank, who is psychologically unstable, is not just a failure in operational terms, it is a potential catastrophe in a facility full of other blanks, in a location that already exerts a constant low-grade psychological pressure on everyone within it. Combat training, though notably the Culexus does not rely heavily on conventional weapons, and the cultivation of the particular mindset that makes a Culexus operative function. The quiet, focused, cold-blooded patience that is the characteristic psychology of the truly effective assassin. There is also a dimension of the Culexus training that is worth considering carefully, which is the training of self-perception. A blank coming into the Culexus program has, in most cases, spent their entire life experiencing themselves as something wrong, as a problem, as a source of distress to everyone around them. The temple takes this and reshapes it. Not by convincing the operative that their condition is something to be proud of, exactly, but by recontextualizing it, by providing a framework in which the thing that has made their entire life difficult is also the thing that makes them uniquely, irreplaceably valuable, by giving purpose to what has always been only burden. Whether this recontextualization is entirely healthy, whether the psychological framework the Culexus training builds is genuinely good for the operatives themselves, or whether it is primarily useful for making them functional weapons, is a question the lore leaves open. The Culexus temple does not, as far as any available source indicates, employ anything resembling therapeutic support or genuine care for the psychological welfare of its operatives as ends in themselves. What psychological attention is given to operatives is given in the service of operational effectiveness. A stable operative is a reliable operative. An unstable one is a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. The distinction the temple draws is about reliability, not well-being. The physical training is extensive. The null aura does not make a Culexus invincible to physical harm. Conventional weapons can still wound and kill them. A bullet does not know or care whether its target has a soul. The Ethereum makes them difficult to target, and their null aura makes enemy soldiers' aim unreliable, but these are partial protections rather than absolute ones, and an operative caught in concentrated conventional fire will eventually be overcome. Physical toughness, agility, and the kind of combat reflexes that allow a person to move through a fire-active environment without becoming a casualty are therefore real components of the Culexus training program, even though they are secondary to the psychological and null aura-focused elements. The people who emerge from this process are genuinely different from every other category of human being in the Imperium. They are not space marines, though they might survive encounters that would kill ordinary humans. They are not inquisitors, though they operate with a similar level of absolute authority in their narrow domain. They are not psychers of any kind, obviously. They are something that has no comfortable category, born without a soul, shaped by a training program designed in the deepest possible secrecy, wielding a weapon that is their own nature, and sent out into the galaxy, one by one, to find and kill the most dangerous psychic entities in existence. And then, when the mission is done, brought back to the fortress and kept there. Kept, not celebrated, not integrated, not given the kind of honored place in the Imperium's culture that Space Marines enjoy, or even the professional respect that most Inquisitors command. Kept, because the Imperium does not know what to do with them when they are not being used, and because the politics of letting them move freely through Imperial society are complicated in ways that nobody wants to manage. There are factions within the Imperium. The lore makes this explicitly clear, that would gladly see every blank executed and the Culexus temple burned to its foundations. Not because the Culexus have done anything wrong, not because they are corrupt or unreliable or poorly controlled, but because they exist, because their existence is uncomfortable, because the Imperium, for all its vast power and its 10,000 years of history, has never entirely made its peace with the people it has found most useful in certain situations, but most disturbing to live alongside in every other situation. The Culexus Temple is the institutional resolution to that discomfort. It takes the people nobody wants near them, puts them somewhere nobody has to see them, trains them into the most effective version of what they already are, and then uses them. And when the using is done, it puts them back where nobody has to see them again. That is, the fortress of the soulless. A prison that its inhabitants may not always experience as a prison, but that functions as one, built not out of cruelty, but out of the particular cold pragmatism that the Imperium has refined over 10,000 years of trying to survive in a universe that is actively trying to kill it. Section 5. The Biology of Dread. Why they break psychers. Understanding the Culexus as a killer requires understanding the mechanism, not the war gear, not the tactics, but the fundamental biological and metaphysical reality of what a blank actually does to the world around them. Because the Culexus does not kill the way other assassins kill. The other temples hurt and destroy and deceive with things they do. The Culexus hurts and destroys simply by being. And once you understand the full scope of that effect, the entire edifice of tactics and war gear built around it makes a particular kind of terrible sense. Start with what the warp actually is, at least as the 40,000 setting describes it. The Immaterium, the Empyrean, the Sea of Souls, all of these names refer to the same thing. A parallel dimension underlying and interpenetrating with real space, composed of psychic energy that is shaped and defined by the emotions and thoughts and spiritual life of every conscious being in the physical universe. Every soul, every fragment of consciousness, every dreaming mind contributes to the warp's vast, churning, incomprehensible ocean. The warp is not empty space with some rules different from our own. It is, in a very real sense, made of people, made of the residue of their experience, their passion, their fear, their belief, A normal human being, one without psychic gift, has a small but real presence in the warp. A tiny echo of their consciousness exists there, a soul light, as the lore sometimes calls it. This is the thing that daemons prey upon, that chaos corruption reaches through, that psychers can perceive when they reach out with their witch sight. It is small, in most humans, barely brighter than a candle, but it is there, and it is real, and its presence in the warp means that the living universe recognizes you in some fundamental sense. A psycher's soul light is considerably brighter. A powerful psyker blazes in the warp like a searchlight, visible to anything nearby in that parallel dimension, which is part of why unsanctioned or undisciplined psychers attract demonic attention so reliably. They are beacons in a sea of hungry things. A blank has none of this. Not a dim flame. Not a buried ember. Nothing. Where a blank exists in real space, the warp shows a void, a hole, a region of perfect psychic silence that contains no soul echo, no emotional resonance, no trace of a consciousness at all. And this void is not passive. It is not like a simple gap in a crowd. It is actively pressing against the fabric of the warp around it, suppressing psychic energy, dampening the connection between the immaterium and real space, creating a bubble of null space that grows in radius and intensity in proportion to the strength of the blank's gene expression. Now, consider what this feels like if you are a psyker. Your power, your gift, your curse, whatever you call it, is your connection to the warp. Every time you reach out with telekinesis to move an object, you are using the warp. Every time you throw a bolt of lightning, or read someone's surface thoughts, or feel the shape of the future slightly before it arrives, you are using the warp. It is the channel through which everything you do flows. It is as fundamental to your experience of reality as your five senses are to a non-psyker. And then a Culexus walks toward you. At first you might feel it only as a general unease, a sense that something is wrong. The connection to the warp that has been part of your awareness for as long as you remember is starting to get harder to feel. It is like trying to see through fog that wasn't there a moment ago, then thicker. Then you try to reach for a power and it simply doesn't respond. The way a limb stops responding to your brain's signals when it has gone deeply numb, and the panic that comes with that realization is, by most accounts, completely overwhelming. Then comes the pain. Because your connection to the warp is not just a tool. Over years of living with psychic ability, the psyker's brain physically restructures itself around that connection. Neural pathways form that are tied to the warp in ways that cannot simply be switched off without consequence. When a Culexus's null aura severs that connection, those pathways do not just go quiet. They are suddenly starved of the energy they have been channeling, and the structural effect of that starvation on a brain that has organized itself around constant psychic input is described as feeling like those pathways are tearing. Like the silence itself has weight, and it is falling on every part of you simultaneously. Weak psychers can be rendered unconscious purely by proximity to a powerful blank. The lore records instances of moderately powerful psychers experiencing cardiac events from the physiological shock of sudden, forcible disconnection from the warp. Very powerful psychers, those who have built enormous personal defenses and psychic fortifications over decades of training, can resist somewhat longer. But even they are weakened, slowed, confused, their power fractured and inconsistent, their focus shattered by the alien wrongness radiating from the approaching void. And this is all happening before the Culexus uses any of their actual weapons. For non-psychers, the effect is different, but still significant. Ordinary humans do not have a conscious connection to the warp and do not draw power from it in any active way. But their brains, like all brains in a universe permeated by the immaterium, operate against a background of psychic resonance that they have never been aware of and have never had to think about. Remove that background, dampen it suddenly with the proximity of a powerful blank, and the effect on baseline human psychology is subtle but real. Cognitive function degrades slightly. Concentration becomes harder. The instinct to be somewhere else, anywhere else, grows louder and harder to ignore. In extreme cases, prolonged proximity to a very powerful blank causes people to forget what they were doing, to make mistakes they would not normally make, to act on impulse in ways that feel later as though something else was directing their hands. This effect on non-psychers is also what makes the Culexus difficult to target in a conventional tactical sense. The Ethereum layer of their body glove compounds this by creating visual and sensory distortion, making the Culexus appear ghost-like, flickering, insubstantial. But even without the Ethereum, the null aura itself makes it genuinely hard to focus on a blank. Soldiers who try to shoot at an approaching Culexus find their attention sliding off their target, their aim going wrong in ways they cannot correct for, their fire discipline breaking down under the weight of an anxiety that has no name but that feels, to the men and women experiencing it, like the ground beneath them is no longer quite solid. For daemons, the effect is in a different category entirely. Daemons are not physical beings with a psychic connection to the warp. Daemons are the warp, given temporary form in real space through the sustained investment of enough psychic energy and the right ritual circumstances. They exist at the boundary between the immaterium and real space, constantly drawing on the warp to maintain their physical manifestation. The void that a blank represents, the absolute negation of warp presence in their immediate vicinity, does not just weaken a daemon, it actively threatens their cohesion. A sufficiently powerful blank, particularly one whose null aura has been amplified by the Culexus training and war gear, essentially pulls the rug of psychic energy out from under a manifested daemon. The daemon cannot maintain its material form. It unravels. It is, quite literally, unmade, not destroyed in the sense of being killed, but stripped of the psychic scaffold that allows it to exist in the physical world, and forced back into the warp. This is why Culexus assassins are also useful against demonic incursions, not just individual psyker targets. An Ordo Malleus Inquisitor, who brings a Culexus operative on a mission involving demonic entities, is bringing the most efficient daemon suppressor available outside of a proper purification ritual, one that does not require chanting or specialist equipment beyond what the Culexus carries already. It is also worth noting what a Culexus's null aura does to the act of sorcery and ritual psychic casting specifically, because this reveals something about the mechanism that distinguishes it from simple anti-psychic fields. A chaos sorcerer does not simply flip a switch and produce a psychic effect. They build up to it, drawing power from the warp through a process that involves concentration, ritual, and the sustained maintenance of a channel between themselves and the immaterium. This is a process that takes time, and during that time, the sorcerer is vulnerable. They are reaching into the warp and pulling on it, and that means their connection to the warp is at its most active and most exposed. When a Culexus's null aura reaches a sorcerer in the middle of a casting, the effect is not just that the power fails to arrive. The channel that the sorcerer has opened, the connection they have established between themselves and the immaterium as part of the casting process, collapses in the same moment that the null aura hits it. And a collapsed channel of that kind is not a gentle failure. It is a reversal. The power the sorcerer has already drawn up into themselves, the warp energy that they were in the process of shaping into a weapon or a ward or a summoning, has nowhere to go. The Culexus has closed the exit. The warp energy, already committed, already partially shaped, rebounds inward into the sorcerer who drew it. This is what the lore describes as powers turning inward and tearing bloody gouges in the psyker's psyche. It is not metaphorical. The backlash from a disrupted casting, when the disruption is caused by a Culexus rather than by conventional psychic interference, is experienced as a physical wound, because in the 40,000 universe, psychic damage is physical damage. The warp and the material universe are not separate enough for harm done to one to leave the other untouched. The Tyranid hive mind presents yet another fascinating case. The hive mind is a collective psychic intelligence that connects all Tyranid organisms in a given fleet through a Gestalt psychic network. Individual Tyranids without the hive mind are much less dangerous, confused, and disoriented without the constant psychic direction they have evolved to rely upon. A Culexus in the vicinity of a Tyranid force disrupts that network in the same way it disrupts any other psychic connection, and Tyranid organisms within range begin to behave with reduced coordination, reduced tactical efficiency, increased individual confusion. Even something as physically formidable as a hive tyrant has been documented balking at the presence of a Culexus, because the sensory experience of approaching a powerful blank, even for a creature that has no soul in the conventional sense, but is itself an expression of psychic will, is apparently sufficiently distressing to affect behavior. The lore also notes that Eldari, who are an inherently psychic species at every level of their biology, and whose connection to the warp is even more fundamental and intimate than that of human psychers, find the Culexus particularly horrifying. Craftworld Eldari warlocks, when asked in contexts where such questions can even be posed, describe the Culexus as nothing short of the embodiments of pure evil. This is not a metaphorical statement from their perspective. In Eldari philosophy and spirituality, the soul is everything. The soul is what makes a person real, what makes them matter, what gives their existence meaning. A being without a soul, in Eldari terms, is not just empty. It is a fundamental violation of the natural order. It is something that should not exist. And when that emptiness is amplified and weaponized and directed at the warp sensitive, it is, to Eldari perception, the very essence of darkness. This is the engine of the Culexus, not bolters, not blades, not the mechanical power of a space marine, just the fact of what they are, refined and focused, and turned against everything that relies on the warp to exist. Section 6. Wargear of the Soulless. Instruments of the Void. A Culexus assassin carries very little by the standards of other Imperial operatives. There is no bolt pistol, no combat knife, no grenades of the fragmentation variety that most soldiers depend upon as their fallback for close work. The loadout is spare, specific, and every element of it exists to do one thing and do it precisely: amplify, focus, and weaponize the null aura that the Culexus carries as their birthright. The centerpiece of the entire Culexus weapon system is the Animus Speculum. In practical terms, the Animus Speculum is a helmet. In lore terms, it is one of the most sophisticated and least understood pieces of technology in the Imperium's arsenal. Even among the Adeptus Mechanicus, who built it and who maintain the templates for its construction, the precise mechanisms by which it operates are described as speculative. The tech priests who work on it are not entirely certain how it achieves the results it achieves. They know what it does. They are less confident about the full picture of why. What they know it does is this. In its passive mode, the Animus Speculum acts as a dampening device. It suppresses and controls the Culexus's own null aura, pulling it back behind a kind of psychic containment shell. This is the mode in which the Culexus approaches its deployment zone. With the Animus Speculum's dampeners active, the Culexus is still profoundly uncomfortable to be near, but not to the full devastating degree that their raw, unfiltered null aura produces. This allows them to travel with escort, to be present in operational staging areas without completely disabling the psychers on their own side, and to approach their targets without their presence, radiating outward like a lighthouse signal, announcing their exact location to every psychically sensitive being for kilometers around. When the moment comes, when the Culexus operative is in position, and the custodian who accompanies them removes the containment protocols and releases the dampeners, the full force of the null aura floods the battlefield in an instant. The central lens of the helmet, described as a grotesque eye set into a leering faceplate, is where the second function of the Animus Speculum operates. This lens harvests the psychic energy that the Culexus's null aura has stripped from nearby psychers, the ambient warp energy that can no longer maintain its connection to its source and is therefore floating free, displaced, and accumulating around the void of the Culexus's presence. It collects this energy, focuses it, concentrates it behind the lens, and then fires it in directed bolts of negative psychic energy. This is the mechanism that makes the Animus Speculum so extraordinarily effective against concentrations of psychers. The more psychers there are in the vicinity, the more displaced warp energy there is available to harvest. The more displaced energy available, the more powerful each blast from the Animus Speculum becomes. In recorded tactical engagements where Culexus operatives have been deployed against significant gatherings of Eldari warlocks or human psyker convocations, the Animus Speculum has fired bursts of terrifying power, its shots multiplying in number with each additional psychic mine nearby that contributes involuntarily to the ammunition supply. The bolts it fires are not conventional energy weapons. They are not lasfire or plasma or melta energy. They are negative psychic energy, the conceptual opposite of warp power, and the effect of a direct hit on a psyker is not merely to cause physical damage, though that certainly occurs. The bolt fractures the psychic architecture of the target's connection to the warp from within. Powers turn inward. Carefully maintained psychic defenses are not just bypassed, but actively turned against their own builder. A psyker struck by the animus speculum does not simply take a wound. They experience what the lore describes as having their own power torn back against them, a reversal so violent and so complete that it tears what might be called bloody gouges in their psyche. Not metaphorically, actual damage to the psychic structure of a psyker's mind, which, in a universe where mind and warp are fundamentally intertwined, is a form of damage that is entirely real and that heals, if it heals at all, with extreme difficulty. At close range, the Culexus can also simply drain the life force from psyker targets through the sustained application of their null aura. Their bare hands and their presence, working in concert with the animus speculum's focused energies to strip away the psychic animating force of the target in a way that, for purely psychic entities like demons, or for heavily warp-reliant psykers who have become partially merged with the Imperium, is completely lethal. The second major piece of Culexus war gear is the Sin-Skin body glove, which incorporates two separate technological layers that work in concert. The first layer is the Ethereum. This is the technology that makes a Culexus operationally difficult to target, even with conventional weapons. The Ethereum shifts the wearer out of phase with normal reality, in a precisely controlled and highly localized way, creating a visual effect that observers describe as ghost-like, insubstantial, flickering, as though the Culexus is being projected onto a faulty screen. The image of the operative is present, but it slides around in the eye, refuses to hold still, makes the visual cortex work against itself in trying to resolve something that is not quite fully in phase with the light around it. In practical, tactical terms, units attempting to shoot at a Culexus assassin must pass specific mental discipline checks, or their fire will simply go wrong. Not because the Culexus dodges with superhuman reflexes, but because hitting them requires overcoming the deep sensory wrongness that their combination of null aura and Ethereum creates. The Ethereum can also be used to make the Culexus entirely invisible, not to psychic senses, since a blank is already invisible in the warp, but to normal physical senses. A fully phased-out Culexus moving through an enemy formation is present only as a feeling of wrongness, a cold spot in a room, a collective unease that makes the soldiers shift and check their corners without ever being able to identify what they are looking at. The reappearance, when the Culexus chooses to make themselves visible again, is timed for maximum psychological impact. The second layer is the Force Matrix, a network of psychic conduits woven through the body glove that is made from material similar to what is used in Force weapons. The Force Matrix acts as a collector and conductor for the ambient warp energy that the Culexus's null aura is constantly displacing. A Culexus operative cannot draw on the warp directly. They have no psychic gift of their own, and their null aura means that warp energy cannot approach them or be channeled by them in any natural way. But the Force Matrix creates a kind of indirect circuit, gathering the psychic energy that has been stripped from nearby psykers and that is floating free in the local environment, and converting it into a form that the Culexus can use to power their abilities and enhance the killing force of the animus speculum. The closer the Culexus is to psykers, the more energy the Force Matrix gathers, and the more powerful the Culexus becomes, in a feedback loop that makes them exponentially more dangerous in exactly the environments where psykers are concentrated and the warp is most active. The third element of the Culexus loadout is the Psych-Out grenade. These are among the rarest weapons in the entire Imperium, and understanding why explains something fascinating about the relationship between the Culexus temple and the broader structure of Imperial power. Psych-Out grenades function by releasing a pressurized cloud of psi-refractive particles, a substance so densely impregnated with negative psychic energy that its dispersal in an area has an effect on nearby psykers, similar in kind, if not in intensity, to the proximity effect of a blank themselves. The cloud strips psychic ability, disrupts concentration, causes pain and disorientation to psyker targets, and is devastating to demonic entities attempting to maintain their presence in real space. The substance used to make these grenades is a metabolic byproduct of the Golden Throne itself. Let that sit for a moment. The Golden Throne, the ancient and failing device upon which the Emperor of mankind sits in a state between life and death, sustaining the Astronomicon and holding back the tides of the warp at the cost of his own continued agony, produces a metabolic byproduct in its constant workings. The nature of this byproduct is described only obliquely in the lore, but it is a dust-like substance, heavily charged with negative psychic energy, that is a direct result of the Emperor's sustained interaction with the warp on the largest scale imaginable. Collecting it is presumably not a comfortable process, and the quantities available are presumably limited, since the Imperium's finest armorers use every bit of it they can gather to produce psych-out grenades and the rare psy-cannon rounds used by the Grey Knights. This means that every time a Culexus assassin throws a psych-out grenade, they are, in a very literal sense, deploying a fraction of the Emperor's own continued sacrifice as a weapon against his enemies, which is the kind of detail that the Warhammer 40,000 setting does so well, the way it layers meaning and implication into seemingly simple pieces of equipment until even the grenades on an assassin's belt carry the weight of cosmological significance. The rarity of psych-out grenades also means that they are rationed carefully, even within the Culexus temple itself. An operative is not given an unlimited supply. The grenades issued for a specific mission reflect the officio's assessment of what will be needed for the specific target and environment, and there is presumably a significant administrative process around their production, their storage, and their allocation. Every grenade represents a portion of the Emperor's own ongoing sacrifice, collected with difficulty from the metabolic workings of the Golden Throne. Using one is, in some sense, spending a fragment of the most significant and painful act in human history. This gives the psych-out grenade a symbolic weight in the lore that the Culexus temple presumably emphasizes in training, though the nature of that emphasis is not made explicit in available sources. Whether the operatives are taught to regard the grenades with reverence, as physical manifestations of the Emperor's continued influence, even in his current state of death and life on the Golden Throne, or whether they are taught to regard them as simply the most effective tool available for specific situations, is not something the available lore resolves. Both interpretations are consistent with what the temple's training priorities appear to be. Beyond these primary elements, the Culexus receives the standard biological enhancements common to most Officio Assassinorum operatives: reaction, speed, and agility implants that push the body to the edge of human capability; neural conditioning that allows the Culexus to remain functional and focused under conditions of extreme stress and sensory overload; the kind of physical resilience that makes a lone operative capable of operating independently in environments that would kill a normal person quickly and efficiently. This is the panoply of the Culexus. It is not showy. It does not gleam like the Vindicare's Exodus rifle or spark with the controlled fury of an Eversore's power sword. It is quiet. It is strange. It is built around the idea that the most powerful weapon in the room is the void itself, and that everything else is simply there to help the void do its work. Section 7 on the Hunt: How a Culexus Kills. An assassin's art is not just in what they use. It is in how they use it, in the particular shape of the process, from mission assignment to the moment the target stops breathing. And the Culexus process is distinct from every other assassin tradition in the Imperium in ways that tell you a great deal about both its strengths and the careful operational framework built around those strengths. The decision to deploy a Culexus, rather than operatives from one of the other temples, is not made lightly and is not made often. The Culexus are the rarest of all assassin temple operatives, their numbers perpetually insufficient to meet the full scope of demand. This scarcity means that the Officio Assassinorum maintains careful internal triage. In simple terms, the Culexus is deployed when the target is a psyker, when other means of reaching that psyker have failed or are judged insufficient, or when the specific anti-psychic nature of the Culexus's capabilities makes them uniquely suited to the mission in a way that outweighs the rarity cost of using one. The authorization for a Culexus deployment typically originates with the highest levels of the Officio Assassinorum, sometimes in conjunction with the relevant inquisitorial ordo. An Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor tracking a dangerous rogue psyker who has proven resistant to conventional sanctioning teams might formally request Culexus support. An Ordo Malleus investigation that has identified a chaos sorcerer of sufficient power that conventional military operations have repeatedly failed to produce results might trigger an authorization review. In extreme cases, the High Lords of Terra themselves may be involved in the decision, given the strategic implications of certain targets. Once authorized, the preparation for a Culexus mission begins with what might be called the custodian relationship. A Culexus assassin on active duty is not permitted to operate entirely alone, at least not in the approach and staging phases of the mission. Each operative is accompanied by a custodian, a dedicated handler who manages the animus speculum's dampening systems and whose presence serves multiple purposes. Practically, the custodian operates the dampening protocols that keep the Culexus's full aura contained during transit and approach, preventing the premature announcement of the operative's presence to every psychically sensitive being in the operational area. Administratively, the custodian serves as the point of contact between the Culexus and the broader mission structure, managing communication, logistics, and the coordination that an operative who exists outside normal social functioning cannot always handle smoothly. Psychologically, the custodian is perhaps the most important element. The relationship between a Culexus and their custodian is one of the stranger partnerships in the Imperium. The custodian must be psychologically resilient enough to work in close proximity to the blank without being functionally compromised by the null aura. They must develop enough of a working relationship with the operative to communicate effectively, to understand the Culexus's signals and intentions, to provide the kind of operational support that requires genuine mutual awareness. And they must do all of this while knowing that the person they are closest to in the world makes everyone around them deeply uncomfortable and is ultimately being handled rather than partnered. The lore does not romanticize this relationship. Inquisitor Havelock Blackheel's recorded sentiment that they needed to replace acolytes assigned to watch over a Culexus with alarming frequency suggests that the custodian role is one that wears people down even when they are well selected for it. The approach to a target typically exploits every advantage the Culexus's nature provides. With the animus speculum's dampeners engaged, the operative can move through non-psychic populations with manageable, if uncomfortable, effect. The Ethereum makes them difficult to target with conventional weapons and hard to perceive clearly. The combination of these factors allows a Culexus to infiltrate operational areas that would be impossible for a conventional assassin, not by disguising themselves as someone else the way a Calidus would, not by finding a physical angle of approach that conventional snipers cannot, but by being so deeply wrong in their presence that human attention simply slides off them like rain off glass. Once the Culexus is within range of the target, everything changes. The custodian releases the animus speculum's dampening field. The full null aura expands outward in an instant, rolling across the battlefield or the chamber or whatever environment the kill is occurring in, like a wave of cold silence. Every psyker in range feels it immediately. Powers fail, concentration shatters. The panic that sets in for a psyker facing the sudden total loss of their abilities is not just psychological, it is physiological. It is everything their body has learned to rely upon, simply ceasing to function without warning. And the response is one of acute, overwhelming crisis. In this confusion, the Culexus moves. The operative closes on their target through whatever bodyguards or tactical screens remain. These escorts are already struggling. Soldiers who might otherwise form a disciplined defensive ring around their charge find their focus fragmenting under the pressure of the null aura, their fire going wide, their coordination breaking down, their instincts telling them to be anywhere but here. The Ethereum makes targeting the approaching Culexus still harder. The result is that a figure who carries no gun and no sword in the conventional sense walks through the middle of a defensive formation with relative impunity, reaching out with blasts from the animus speculum's lens to neutralize the most dangerous psyker elements as they close the final distance. The kill itself is typically done at close range, either through the life-draining contact of the Culexus's null aura at its most concentrated, through the focused fire of the animus speculum at point-blank range, where its negative energy bolts are at their most devastating, or through a combination of both that strips the target's psychic defenses away before removing their capacity to remain alive. For daemon targets, the process has a particular elegance. A daemon cannot simply be shot dead with a bolter. at least not permanently. Destroying a daemon's physical form sends it back to the warp, where it eventually reforms and returns. But a Culexus's null aura at close range does not just destroy the daemon's physical form. It unravels the psychic scaffolding that gives the daemon any form at all. The daemon is not sent back to the warp. It is stripped of the connection to the warp that allows it to manifest in the first place. The results can be permanent, in a way that few other forms of anti-demonic combat can achieve. There is also the psychological dimension of the kill itself that deserves attention, because it is one of the ways the Culexus differs most dramatically from every other assassin template. A Vindicare sniper pulls a trigger, and a target falls. A Calidus operative slips a blade between ribs and walks away. An Eversor tears through everything in the room until nothing moves. These are all violent, some more dramatically so than others, but they are all recognizable as acts of physical killing. What a Culexus does in close proximity to a psyker target is harder to categorize. The target feels themselves changing, feels the connection that has defined their experience of reality for their entire psychically gifted life, being methodically and completely severed. Feels their power, the thing they may have believed made them exceptional, made them powerful, made them beyond the reach of ordinary human consequences, simply drain away into the silence that approaches. The physical killing, when it comes, is almost incidental. The psyker target is frequently already in a state of acute crisis, their sense of self shattered by the loss of the capability that was at the center of their identity, before the Culexus makes the final physical move that ends the engagement. This is not accidental, and it is not a side effect that the temple views with indifference. The psychological devastation of a powerful psyker who encounters a Culexus, the word spreading through the communities of unsanctioned witches, or chaos sorcerers, or Aeldari warlocks, that their kind has an enemy who can reach them in the one place they thought they were safe, is itself a tactical asset. Fear is a force multiplier. A reputation for being the thing that kills the unkillable, that reaches the unreachable, that finds the targets who believe their power made them untouchable, has effects on enemy behavior that extend far beyond the specific targets who have been eliminated. The Culexus does not fight battles, it ends threats. And the ending of a threat often begins not with the physical elimination of the target, but with the moment the target first hears, secondhand through whispered rumor, that the Culexus exists. The Culexus's role in battlefield scenarios, rather than pure assassination contexts, follows similar principles, but at a larger operational scale. When deployed to support a military operation rather than to kill a single target, the Culexus acts as a walking suppression field. Every psyker on the opposing side within range is functionally limited. Sorcerers cannot cast. Warlocks cannot weave their battle magic. Chaos spawn, whose very existence is warp-empowered experience, disruptions in their fundamental coherence. The Culexus does not need to engage these threats directly. Simply being present in the right position on the battlefield shapes what the enemy can do in a radius around the operative, creating dead zones in the enemy's psychic capability that friendly forces can exploit. This is why certain engagements in the lore describe the arrival of a Culexus operative on the battlefield as having effects far disproportionate to what a single individual should be able to achieve. Engagements where an entrenched psychic enemy had been repeatedly repelling Imperial attacks suddenly shift when the Culexus arrives. Not because the Culexus kills hundreds of opponents personally, but because removing the psychic advantage that was enabling the enemy's success changes the fundamental calculus of the fight. In the aftermath of a mission, when the target is dead and the operation is complete, the Culexus returns, back to the custodian, back to the fortress, back to the silence that is always there, waiting, because there is nowhere else for them to go, and the Imperium has not built a life for them outside the one it takes from them and then uses. Section 8. Notable missions and operations. The operational history of the Culexus Temple is, by institutional design, almost entirely unrecorded in any public archive. What fragments do exist in accessible Imperial records are either heavily redacted, third-hand accounts from people who were present at engagements without understanding what they were witnessing, or the kind of oblique official language that acknowledges a result without explaining a method. Target neutralized by Officio Assassinorum operatives could mean a Vindicare's bullet. It could also mean something considerably stranger. But a few operations have made their way into sources that can be examined, and each one tells a story that illustrates something specific and important about what the Culexus is and what it can accomplish. The most narratively rich and lore-significant appearance of a Culexus operative in any canonical story belongs to Iota, the Culexus assassin featured in the Horus Heresy novel Nemesis, written by James Swallow. Iota is remarkable for several reasons, not least of which is that she is a clone, not a naturally born pariah, but one of what the lore calls a replicae, a laboratory-created individual whose existence began in a test tube at the instruction of the Emperor's own biologians. The fact that the Culexus clade was already producing vat-grown operatives during the Horus Heresy, at the very dawn of the Imperium's history, tells you something about both the ambition of the project and the scarcity of naturally occurring pariah talent. Iota is part of the first-ever execution force, a team composed of assassins drawn from every one of the clades, assembled for a mission of unprecedented ambition. Their target is Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the fallen Primarch at the heart of the greatest betrayal in human history. The plan is to kill him before the heresy can progress far enough to be irreversible, to cut off the head of the rebellion while it is still, theoretically, cuttable. The Nemesis narrative shows us the Culexus assassin in a way that very few stories manage, which is as a human being, or something close to one. Iota does not speak easily. She exists at the edge of the operational group, separated from the others by the same barrier that separates every blank from every person they encounter. The fact that being near her is uncomfortable in a way that no amount of professional discipline entirely suppresses. But she thinks, and she observes, and she has something that might be will, or something that might be purpose. And the question of what that makes her, in a universe that regards her kind as fundamentally lesser, as a tool rather than a person, hangs over her chapters of the narrative without ever being fully resolved. The mission to kill Horus fails. The execution force reaches Dagonet, the world where Horus is believed to be, and discovers that the chaos already spreading from the War Master's decision has twisted and corrupted everything around the target. Iota is eventually destroyed by Spear, the Black Pariah, and this brings us to the other Culexus-adjacent story that Nemesis tells simultaneously. Spear is the inverse of Iota in almost every sense. Where Iota is a controlled, trained, purpose-built weapon of the Imperium, Spear is the consequence of a program that went wrong. He is described as a failed project, the Black Pariah experiment, the Culexus clade's attempt to create an even more powerful version of their operatives by pushing the genetic and psychic engineering further than it had ever been pushed before. The result was an individual of extraordinary null power, but profoundly unstable psychology, someone whose mind could not tolerate what had been done to it, without fracturing in ways that made them uncontrollable. Spear was abandoned by the Culexus clade. He was found by Erebus, the Word-bearer's dark apostle, one of the architects of the Horus Heresy on the Chaos side, who recognized the potential of a powerful blank, bonded to a demonic entity in a symbiotic possession. What Erebus did to Spear should not have been possible. Daemons and blanks are antithetical to each other's existence. A daemon cannot maintain its coherence near a powerful blank. Binding one to a blank should be like trying to store fire inside ice. But the ritual Erebus performed created something genuinely unprecedented, a being who combined the null aura of a pariah with the physical and perceptual capabilities of a daemonically enhanced entity, allowing it to change its appearance to match anyone it had killed, to move through the world in borrowed faces, to reach targets that no conventional assassin could reach. Spear's mission is to kill the Emperor, using a drop of the Emperor's own blood preserved on an ancient rogue trader's warrant of trade to give him the psychic vector he needs to reach through the Emperor's own defenses. The full horror of this plan, and the counter-mission undertaken by the execution force to stop it instead of continuing their Horus mission, forms the climax of Nemesis in a way that shows just how central the Culexus concept is to the stakes of the Horus Heresy period. In the events of the 41st millennium, the recorded Culexus operations are fewer but equally illuminating in what they reveal about how the temple is deployed. In the year 290 of the 41st millennium, the Officio Assassinorum faced a problem that had defeated operatives from 2 of its other temples. A Chaos Lord named Malfeasius was operating within the Eye of Terror and had proven resistant to every attempt at elimination. Eversor operatives, those bio-enhanced berserkers who are essentially dropped into a target area and pointed at the problem, had failed. Vindicare marksmen, the finest precision shooters in the Imperium, had also failed. The reasons for these failures are not spelled out in detail, but given that Malfeasius was operating inside the Eye of Terror, which is saturated with warp energy and produces an environment where psychic ability is massively amplified, it is not difficult to imagine why conventional approaches fell short. A target who can perceive bullets before they arrive, who can rewrite probability slightly in his favor, who operates in an environment that enhances his every psychic capability, is not a target that conventional means can reliably reach. The Culexus assassin Vadrex was sent instead. What follows in the lore record is one of the most striking accounts of Culexus patience in any recorded source. Vadrex did not rush in. He haunted Malfeasius. He followed the Chaos Lord across the Eye of Terror, always nearby, always present at the edge of the operative's aura range, letting the cumulative effect of that proximity work on Malfeasius's capabilities and psychology over time. What this must have been like for Malfeasius, for a powerful psyker to feel the edges of his ability fraying, to feel that wrongness pressing at him from somewhere he could never quite locate, is left to the imagination. But the lore tells us that only when Malfeasius finally ascended to daemon princehood, a transformation that paradoxically made him more vulnerable to the specific tools Vadrex was carrying, did the Culexus make his move. A daemon prince is, by definition, something that has merged with the warp on a fundamental level. The transformation trades mortal limitations for extraordinary power, but it also makes the transformed entity far more thoroughly warp-dependent than they were in their mortal state. And warp-dependent things have a very specific weakness when a Culexus assassin is in the room. Vadrex struck with psych-out grenades, the products of the Golden Throne's metabolic workings, into the newly ascended Daemon Prince's presence. The blasts reeled Malfeasius. The Animus Speculum followed with a punishing series of focused, negative energy attacks. The Daemon Prince, who had been untouchable to bolters and sniper fire, was destroyed. The Iota and Spear stories together form one of the most sophisticated pieces of Culexus-related lore in the Black Library catalog, and deserve more than a summary treatment. Because the genius of Nemesis as a piece of writing, in the context of what it adds to Culexus lore, is that it puts 2 pariahs on opposite sides of the same conflict, and invites the reader to sit with the implications of that. Iota is what the Culexus program produces when it works as intended. A blank who has been given form and purpose by the temple, who operates within the constraints of her mission parameters, who interacts with the other members of the execution force with a kind of careful, studied behavior that approximates normal social engagement, even when the social mechanics that produce normal engagement are not available to her in the usual ways. She is not entirely opaque. She has preferences, observations, something that functions like professional respect for the Vindicare team leader Aristadekel. She is functional within the structure that has been built around her. Spear is what happens when none of that structure is present. A blank of greater raw power than Iota, abandoned by the organization that created him before the process of giving purpose and framework to that power could be completed. Left to find his own meaning in a universe that reacted to him the way the universe always reacts to blanks, with the instinctive withdrawal of everyone who comes near, amplified in Spear's case to something more extreme by the greater intensity of his null aura and the psychological instability that the Culexus clade had determined made him too dangerous to continue developing. What Erebus did with Spear, the ritual bonding of a daemon to a blank, is described in Nemesis as something genuinely unprecedented and genuinely frightening even to the entities of the warp themselves. The daemon bound to Spear provides him with capabilities he should not have, primarily the ability to absorb the identities of people he has killed and assume them convincingly. But the daemon cannot fully integrate with its host. A daemon in a blank is like a fire in a sealed room with no oxygen. It can sustain itself for a time, but the relationship is one of mutual consumption rather than partnership, and what it produces is not a powerful, stable entity, but a profoundly dangerous, deeply unstable one. The Chaos side's decision to send Spear against the Emperor, while the Loyalists' execution force is going after Horus, creates a structural elegance in the novel that elevates it beyond a simple action story. The Imperium is trying to decapitate the rebellion. The rebellion is trying to decapitate the Imperium, and caught in the middle of this mutual assassination attempt are two pariahs. One of them, a product of the most careful and responsible institutionalization of the pariah gene that the Imperium has ever managed. The other, a product of abandonment and exploitation, and the worst possible exploitation of the same gene by the most malevolent forces in the galaxy. They eventually meet, and the confrontation between Iota and Spear is about as close as the Warhammer universe ever gets to a fight between two characters who are fundamentally the same kind of being. Two blanks, the void versus the void, with a demon ghost layered over one of them like a borrowed skin that does not quite fit. Spear wins. Iota is destroyed. But the fact of the confrontation and what it reveals about both characters and about what the pariah gene can become in the hands of very different masters lingers in the lore in a way that informs how you think about every Culexus assassin after. The mission against the Dread Gestalt is different in character and reveals a different dimension of the Culexus's operational role. In the year 353 of the 41st millennium, the Wordvane Psykers of the 122nd Vostroyan Firstborn emerged from a difficult warp translation as a merged Gestalt entity. These were sanctioned Imperial Psykers who had, through the trauma of a particularly violent warp journey, had their individual psychic presences merged into a single, terrifying, shared consciousness of considerably greater power than any of them possessed individually. The Gestalt turned on its own regiment. It enslaved the soldiers around it to its collective will. When it arrived on the world of Sylvanus II, it began systematically destroying the population. The Hammers of Dorn, a Space Marine chapter, were sent to deal with the problem. They were repelled with ease. The Gestalt's fused psychic power was so vast that Space Marine tactical doctrine simply was not calibrated for it. Conventional battlefield tools had been tried and had failed. The Culexus assassin, known in records only as the Revoker, was sent. When the Revoker entered range of the Dread Gestalt, the fused entity's power began to collapse. The Gestalt, which had been able to throw Space Marines aside like toys, lost its coherence in the null aura. The multiple minds that comprised it, which had merged under psychic pressure, began to separate again under psychic negation, and as they separated, as the terrifying Gestalt power they had formed together fragmented back into its component parts, the members of the 122nd Vostroyan Firstborn, who had been enslaved to it, found themselves suddenly free of that control. Soldiers who had been compelled to fight against their will regained their autonomy, and before the Revoker could even close physically on the target, the soldiers of Vostroyan Regiment, freed from the Gestalt's compulsion, turned on the scattered remnants of what had enslaved them and ended it with their bayonets. A Space Marine chapter had failed against this enemy. A single Culexus assassin solved it with their presence alone, without firing a weapon or throwing a grenade. The enemy simply ceased to be able to do what it had been doing in the Culexus's vicinity. Another notable mission in the records involves what the archives reference as the Sons of the Interstice, a Lubricae cult that arose within the Adeptus Mechanicus. 12 senior technomagi were gathering for what was apparently a ritual of some kind, and a single Culexus was dispatched to the resulting engagement. The details of this mission are more fragmentary in the sources, but it is noted in the context of Culexus operational records as an example of the temple's utility against targets that are not conventional psykers, but whose activities involve the warp in ways that make the Culexus's null aura directly applicable. These missions, taken together, sketch a portrait of the Culexus as the Officio Assassinorum's option of last resort against psychic threats. Not the first choice. Never the first choice, because they are too rare and too valuable and too difficult to replace. But when other means fail, when the target is too powerful or too warp-connected for conventional approaches, the Culexus is what gets sent. And the Culexus, in the records that survive, does not fail. Section 9. The Culexus and the other temples. Position in the Officio. The Officio Assassinorum is not a monolithic institution. It is a collection of specialized orders, each with its own temple, its own philosophy, its own particular art of killing, unified under the officio's authority, but distinct in almost everything else. Understanding where the Culexus sits within this broader picture requires looking at the other three major temples, not as competitors, but as context. The Vindicare Temple produces the Imperium's finest snipers. These are individuals selected for extraordinary perceptual capability, for patience that goes beyond the human norm, for a kind of cold, almost meditative discipline that allows them to wait for days without movement for the perfect moment. They carry the Exodus rifle, a weapon of remarkable sophistication that fires ammunition calibrated for specific targets and specific situations. The Vindicare philosophy, at its core, is about the perfect application of force at the perfect moment. One shot, one kill, maximum effect, minimum exposure. They are precise, they are controllable, they are deployed in situations where the goal is a clean removal, a targeted death that looks, ideally, like misfortune or accident rather than assassination. The Culexus Temple operates around a remarkable pharmacological substance called polymorphine, which allows the operative to reshape their physical body at a cellular level, adopting the appearance, voice, and physical presence of a chosen identity. Culexus assassins are infiltrators and imposters, people who can become anyone and who use that capability to get inside the inner circles of targets who would otherwise be unreachable. They are patient in a different way from the Vindicare, the patience of the actor who inhabits a role for weeks before the performance night, who builds relationships and trust with people they intend to betray. They are the officio's instrument when the goal is not just a death, but a specific death in a specific context, the target killed by their own apparent ally, the plot revealed through the Culexus's manufactured evidence, the organization undermined from within before it even knows it is compromised. The Eversor Temple is the officio's bluntest instrument, and this is not a criticism, because sometimes a blunt instrument is exactly what is needed. Eversor assassins are kept in stasis between missions because, frankly, they are too dangerous to simply walk around. They are bio-enhanced to a degree that borders on transformation, dosed with a cocktail of combat stimulants and neural enhancers that push their aggression and physical capability to levels that make them killing machines in the most literal possible sense. They are deployed in situations where the goal is not surgical precision but overwhelming, terrifying violence. A charismatic rebel leader who has built a following large enough to compromise an entire military structure cannot always be reached by a sniper without exposing imperial intentions. Sometimes the most effective message to the broader organization is the sight of what an Eversor does to the man at the top, a sight so visceral and so complete that the rest of the leadership structure collapses rather than face the possibility of the same. The Culexus sits alongside these three as a specialist rather than a generalist, but its specialty is, in some ways, the most extreme of the four. The Vindicare can kill almost any target given the right sightline and the right ammunition. The Culexus can reach almost any target given enough preparation and a convincing identity to assume. The Eversor can devastate almost any physical space and almost any organic defenders within it. But none of these three can walk into a room where a sufficiently powerful psyker is operating and simply negate that psyker's ability to function. None of them are inherently immune to psychic attack. All of them can be killed by a powerful enough sorcerer who detects them before they act. The Culexus cannot be detected by psychic means because they do not exist in the warp. They cannot be targeted by psychic attack because psychic energy passes through the region of space they occupy as though they were not there. They cannot be affected by demonic possession or psychic corruption or the subtle mental manipulations that powerful psykers use to make defenders lower their guard. And the target cannot draw on the very powers that make them dangerous when the Culexus is close enough. This makes the Culexus uniquely valuable in specific scenarios, but it also makes them narrower in scope than the other temples, at least in the sense that they are most effective against psyker targets and considerably less effective as a general-purpose assassination tool. A Culexus deployed against a target who has no psychic ability whatsoever is still a formidable operative. The Ethereum and Null Aura still provide significant tactical advantages, but they are not using the majority of what makes them extraordinary. It is the assassin equivalent of using a specialist tool on a general problem. It works, but you are not getting full value. The rarity factor also shapes the Culexus's position within the officio in practical terms. Operational tempo for the other temples, while never publicly disclosed, is presumably higher. There are more Vindicare operatives than Culexus, more Calidus, almost certainly more Eversor. The pool from which Culexus recruits are drawn is genuinely finite in a way that the pools for the other temples are not, because the pariah gene's rarity is not a recruiting problem that better institutional outreach can solve. It is baked into the genetics of the species. The vat growth program is the Culexus temple's response to this scarcity, and it is, itself, a remarkable piece of institutional ingenuity. By creating pariah candidates in laboratory conditions, the temple is not dependent entirely on the galaxy's random genetic lottery, but the process is described consistently as extraordinarily complex and producing very few viable candidates per year. The attrition of training and active service means that the Culexus temple is, in all probability, chronically undermanned relative to the demand for its operatives. Every decision to deploy one is a calculated gamble, a judgment that this specific target, in this specific situation, is worth committing one of the scarcest resources in the imperial arsenal. The political dynamics within the Officio Assassinorum itself are interesting. The other temples have a relationship with the Culexus that mirrors the Imperium's broader relationship with blanks generally. They are respected in the way that something deeply useful is respected. They are also kept at arm's length in the way that something deeply uncomfortable is kept at arm's length. The execution force model, where operatives from multiple temples are combined for a single mission, requires careful management when a Culexus is part of the team. The other assassins are elite warriors with extraordinary psychological resilience, but even they feel the null aura's pressure. Coordination between a Culexus and a Vindicare or Calidus on the same mission requires a kind of interpersonal management that does not apply to any other pairing within the officio. The relationship between the Culexus and the Eversor is particularly interesting from a philosophical standpoint because these two temples occupy opposite poles of what the Officio Assassinorum does. The Eversor is the maximum application of violence, a being who has been pushed past conventional human limits of aggression and endurance into something that the lore itself struggles to categorize tidily. An Eversor in action is loud, visible, visceral, a storm of blood and fury that makes its presence known to every living thing within range. The Eversor kills everything in the target area, the target included, and the collateral nature of this approach is understood and factored in by the people who authorize Eversor deployments. The Culexus is the precise application of a kind of force that most people would not recognize as force. It is quiet. It is targeted. It moves through a battlefield and kills specifically, carefully, leaving other things largely untouched. Where the Eversor burns the forest, the Culexus removes a single tree with a surgeon's precision and does so in a way that the other trees in the forest may not even fully register has happened until they try to use the space where the tree used to be and find it empty. This contrast says something about the breadth of what the Officio Assassinorum considers assassination to be. The word is usually understood to mean a quiet, precise killing. The Eversor challenges that understanding by being neither quiet nor precise in any conventional sense. The Culexus reinforces it, but by using a mechanism that most people would not recognize as killing at all. A Culexus walking toward a powerful psyker looks, from the outside, like nothing. A figure in strange armor approaching at walking pace. The devastation it represents does not reveal itself until the void reaches its target, and by then, it is already too late. There is also the question of how the Culexus is perceived by the Inquisition, which has a complicated jurisdictional relationship with the Officio Assassinorum that the lore never fully resolves. The Ordo Malleus in particular has an obvious professional interest in anything that can reliably neutralize daemons, and inquisitors of that ordo compete for access to Culexus operatives in ways that put them in friction with the Officio's own chain of command. The Ordo Hereticus similarly values Culexus capability against rogue psychers and witches. The tension between the Ordo's desire to attach Culexus operatives to their own retinues and the Officio's desire to maintain operational control of its assets is one of the quieter bureaucratic conflicts that runs through the lore. without ever quite being resolved. What is interesting about this conflict is what it reveals about the nature of value in the 40,000 universe. The Culexus is a resource whose value is understood by everyone who knows it exists, and whose availability is understood to be completely insufficient to the demand for it. This creates a political dynamic that is fundamentally different from the dynamics around the other temples. There are, presumably, enough Vindicare operatives that an inquisitor who wants access to one can get access to one within a reasonable time frame, without it representing a strategic decision at the highest levels. There are enough Calidus operatives that deployments can be considered against relatively broad criteria of mission suitability. The Culexus is different. Every deployment is a strategic decision. Every commitment of a Culexus operative is a commitment of something genuinely irreplaceable in the short to medium term, since growing a replacement takes years, and training a natural-born pariah recruit into a functional operative takes even longer. The people who control access to Culexus deployments hold genuine power because they hold the key to the one tool that can solve certain problems that nothing else can solve. This makes the Director Primus of the Culexus Temple, whoever they are at any given period of the Imperium's history, a figure of considerable quiet influence. Not the kind of influence that gets displayed at councils or celebrated in ceremony. The kind of influence that is expressed in private conversations, in the decision to grant or deny a specific request, in the awareness that the person you are speaking to could, with the right authorization and the right assignment, make a problem that has been intractable for years suddenly disappear. The Officio Assassinorum as a whole holds this kind of influence, but the Culexus Temple holds a particular concentrated version of it. The Adeptus Mechanicus's attempt to claim the Fortress of the Soulless, which we noted earlier was ended with a sniper's bullet, is one of the more vivid illustrations of how the Officio protects this influence. The Mechanicum built the fortress. They might have some historical claim to it, but the Officio Assassinorum's response to that claim was immediate, decisive, and made entirely without political negotiation. Because the Officio understands that anyone who can claim authority over the Culexus Temple can claim authority over the deployment of Culexus operatives. And that is a form of power that the Officio is not prepared to share with any institution, regardless of historical precedent or technical administrative rights. The bullet that ended the Mechanicum's claim was, in a very real sense, the Officio speaking in its native language. We are the Officio Assassinorum. We do not negotiate jurisdictional disputes. We terminate them. Section 10. The Broader World of Blanks, Sisters of Silence, and the Pariah Nexus. The Culexus Temple is not the only institution in the Imperium that has been built around the Pariah gene. Understanding the full scope of what blanks mean to the 40,000 universe requires looking at the broader context of null entities and the roles they play across multiple organizations and storylines. The most prominent connection is the Sisters of Silence, also known as the Silent Sisterhood, the Null Maidens, the Pale Scourge, and a dozen other names that reflect the range of reactions their existence provokes. The Sisters of Silence are an all-female order of psychic blanks who serve as militant witch hunters, having been founded during the Great Crusade period as the military arm of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. They are, in many ways, the public-facing institutionalization of blank capability in a way that the Culexus Temple is definitively not. The differences between the Sisters of Silence and the Culexus Temple illuminate both organizations. The Sisters of Silence are an organized military force, a cohesive body that fights in formation, wears distinctive power armor, takes a vow of eternal silence as part of their induction, and operates according to a doctrinal framework that resembles conventional military structure more than it does an assassin order. They are a hammer, or more precisely, a suppression field, deployed against groups of psychic threats and rogue psychers in a way that emphasizes their collective null aura as a tactical asset for large-scale operations. They also played a crucial historical role in gathering and transporting the dangerous cargo of psychers collected by the Black Ships, using their null aura to prevent psychic outbreaks among potentially dangerous cargo during transit. The Culexus Temple is a scalpel, single operatives, single targets, maximum precision. The Sisters were also, notably, disbanded, or at least reduced to near extinction, after the Horus heresy, in one of the more unfortunate political decisions in the Imperium's long history of unfortunate political decisions. The exact reasons are debated in the lore, but the general contour involves the post-heresy Imperium's deep distrust of anything unusual, its tendency to react to centuries of catastrophic upheaval by restricting and regulating anything that made people uncomfortable, and the political maneuvering of institutions that had always found the Sisters' presence inconvenient. For nearly 10,000 years, the Silent Sisterhood effectively vanished from imperial affairs, their numbers dwindling, their role absorbed by other institutions, their existence reduced to rumor and legend. Their return, ordered by the Primarch Robut Guilliman in the Era Indomitus, following the opening of the Great Rift, is one of the significant institutional developments of the post-8th edition lore. Guilliman, with the perspective that 10,000 years of stasis had not been enough to shake his appreciation for operational reality, recognized immediately that the Sisters of Silence were an asset the Imperium could not afford to continue leaving unused. The threats that require null entity countermeasures, daemons, chaos sorcerers, rogue psychers of increasing power in the wake of the psychic awakening, had not gone away in the Sisters' absence. They had grown worse. The psychic awakening itself, that galaxy-wide surge of psychic ability that is one of the defining lore developments of the late 41st and early 42nd millennia, has enormous implications for both the Sisters of Silence and the Culexus Temple. As more and more humans manifest psychic ability, as the warp's influence over the material universe grows, as demonic incursions become more common and more intense, the demand for anti-psychic countermeasures of every kind has increased dramatically. The Sisters of Silence are struggling to maintain and grow their numbers in response to this demand. The Culexus Temple is presumably doing the same with its VAT growth programs, though the classified nature of its operations means that public lore about this is sparse. The Necron dimension of the pariah gene adds another layer to the broader picture. The Necrons, those ancient silicon and metal civilization who traded away their flesh and their connection to the warp for a form of immortality they did not fully understand the implications of, have their own complex relationship with blanks. Necron pariahs, which the Necrons created by capturing human blanks and subjecting them to the biotransference process that houses a consciousness in a necrodermis body, are warriors who combine the mechanical durability of the Necron form with the null aura of a human blank. They serve Necron nobles as dedicated anti-psychic weapons, their presence on the battlefield disrupting psychic powers and suppressing the warp influence that opponents might otherwise bring to bear against the fundamentally anti-psychic Necron war doctrine. The theoretical connection between the Necrons and the pariah gene's origin, specifically the now largely retcon notion that the Deceiver created the gene, ties into the Necrons' broader interest in blanks as a resource to be exploited rather than a phenomenon to be understood. More recent lore developments around the Pariah Nexus, a Necron strategic endeavor that appears to involve generating an anti-empiric field on a massive scale, suggest that the Necrons may have ambitions around the null aura that go far beyond the individual Pariah Necron warriors they have used in the past. The Pariah Nexus, introduced more prominently in the Psychic Awakening campaign material and in later supplements, describes a region of space where Necron technology has been used to generate a pervasive field of anti-empiric energy, a kind of large-scale null aura projected across a volume of space rather than emanating from a single individual. Forces entering the Pariah Nexus find psychic abilities suppressed or entirely non-functional, demonic entities destabilized, warp-based navigation disrupted. It is, in essence, an attempt to do what a Culexus assassin does, but at the scale of a stellar region. The Necron relationship with blanks is also interesting in what it reveals about the nature of the null aura itself. The Necrons, having sacrificed their own souls during the biotransference that transformed them from flesh into living metal, are themselves entities without a warp presence. They do not show up in the warp as the soul lights that living things do. But this absence is passive rather than active. A Necron is simply not there in the warp. A blank is the opposite of there, pressing outward against the warp's presence with something that functions like negative psychic energy that actively suppresses the warp rather than merely failing to engage with it. This distinction is what makes human blanks so much more operationally useful against psychic threats than Necron warriors, despite the Necrons being fundamentally anti-warp entities. A Necron warrior in a room does not destabilize a daemon or disrupt a sorcerer's casting. They simply do not contribute to the ambient psychic energy of the space. A blank in the same room actively pulls at everything, warp-connected nearby, disrupting, suppressing, creating the void that their genetic nature demands they generate. The mechanism is different, and the operational consequences are dramatically different. The Dark Eldar's relationship to blanks is also worth a brief note, since it illustrates the breadth of the Null Aura's effects across species and cultures. The Drukhari of Kamara survive by feeding on the pain and suffering of others, drawing the psychic essence of tormented souls into themselves in a process that keeps the warp curse of Slaanesh at bay and sustains their own extended existence. They are predators of souls in the most direct possible sense, and a blank, by their very nature, is not just inedible to this process, they are actively hostile to it. The absence of a soul in a blank does not just mean the Drukhari cannot feed from them. The Null Aura disrupts the Drukhari's ability to feed from nearby victims as well, making the blank a kind of psychic spoilsport who ruins the harvest by their mere presence. It is not difficult to imagine that the Drukhari, who know precisely what souls are and what they provide, would regard a blank with a particular kind of visceral disgust that goes beyond anything a more conventional enemy could provoke. Whether the Necrons are drawing on the same fundamental principle that produces the pariah gene in humans, whether there is some shared underlying mechanism at work, is not something the current lore definitively answers. But the parallel is striking, and it raises questions about what the pariah gene's origin and purpose might ultimately be at the largest possible scale of the 40,000 universe's ongoing conflicts. The Inquisition's use of blanks extends beyond formal Culexus deployments. Inquisitors who understand what blanks are and what they offer have long sought to include null entities in their retinues, where they serve as living psychic suppressors that protect the Inquisitor and their team from the psychic threats they regularly engage. The Ordo Hereticus is particularly likely to include untouchables in an Inquisitor's personal entourage, since Hereticus Inquisitors spend much of their careers pursuing rogue psychers and witch covens. The Ordo Malleus, dealing regularly with demonic entities, values blanks for the protection they provide against demonic influence and possession. These informal arrangements exist alongside and in parallel with the Culexus Temple's formal operational structure, and they reflect the broader truth that the demand for null entity capability in the galaxy of 40,000 exceeds the supply by a significant margin. There are never enough blanks. There are never enough Sisters of Silence. There are never enough Culexus assassins. The Imperium knows what blanks are capable of. It knows how much it needs them in a universe where psychic threats grow more dangerous by the century, and it still cannot find or produce enough of them to meet that need. Section 11. The Human Cost. What it means to be soulless. We have talked about the Culexus as warriors. We have talked about their origin, their training, their war gear, their operations, their position within the Officio Assassinorum. Now, in the final section of this story, I want to sit with something that the lore raises but rarely fully addresses. What does it mean to be one of them? What is the experience from the inside of being a person who has no soul in a universe where having one is the baseline expectation of consciousness itself? The word soulless, in the context of the 40,000 universe, is not metaphorical. It is as close to a literal statement as the setting's metaphysics allows. A blank does not merely have a weak presence in the warp. They have no presence. Where every other conscious being casts an echo of themselves into the immaterium, where even the most ordinary of people has a tiny fragment of their existence reflected in that parallel dimension, a blank generates nothing. The warp does not know they exist. The warp, if it could be said to have a relationship with blanks at all, does not have one. They are outside it in a way that has no parallel in any other category of being. What this means philosophically, and what the lore occasionally reaches toward without fully committing to an answer, is deeply uncomfortable. In the 40,000 universe, the soul is not a theological abstraction. It is a physical reality. Psychers can see souls. Daemons can touch them. The Golden Throne sustains the Emperor's soul at enormous cost. When a person dies, their soul goes somewhere, it passes into the warp, it faces whatever awaits it there in the chaos and hunger of the Imperium. The Eldari fear having their souls consumed by Slaanesh. The threat of a bad death in the 40,000 universe is specifically the threat of what happens to the soul afterward. A blank's death is different. When they die, there is nothing to go anywhere. There is no soul to pass into the warp, no echo to persist, no fragment of consciousness to face the hungry gods, or to scatter into the vast sea of psychic energy that underlies reality. A blank simply ceases to exist in a way that is more complete than any other kind of death. This is either the greatest mercy or the greatest horror, depending on how you interpret the 40,000 universe's cosmology, and the setting, characteristically, refuses to resolve the ambiguity. The social reality of being a blank, even for those who end up in the Culexus temple, and who have therefore found at least a formal institutional context for their existence, is one of permanent isolation of a specific and particularly difficult kind. It is not the isolation of the shy person who struggles to make friends. It is not the isolation of the social outcast who has been rejected for understandable reasons. It is the isolation of someone whose very existence makes the people around them uncomfortable at a level below conscious control, and who therefore cannot form the kind of normal human connections that everyone else takes for granted, not because they are unwilling, but because the universe has wired the people around them to pull away. Blanks in the broader population, those who never get picked up by the Culexus or the Inquisition, often lead brief and miserable lives. They are expelled from communities. They struggle to hold jobs because co-workers cannot tolerate their extended presence. They cannot form lasting romantic relationships, because even when intellectual understanding overcomes the instinctive wrongness, eventually, the constant low-grade discomfort erodes whatever goodwill has been built up. They exist at the absolute fringes of the society that depends on them existing, but cannot make its peace with what they are. For those who end up in the Culexus temple, the picture is complicated. The temple is, in at least some sense, a community of people who share the same fundamental condition. Within the fortress of the soulless, surrounded by other blanks, the null aura's effect on the people around them is at least consistent and known and shared. They are not, in the fortress, the only one. But the fortress is also a prison, in the functional sense, if not the stated sense. They do not leave unless they are being used. They do not integrate with broader imperial society. They do not have the freedom that even the most constrained of the other assassin temple operatives possess, because the political and social consequences of blanks moving freely through normal human spaces are more than the Imperium has ever been willing to manage. The psychological impact of this existence is rarely addressed directly in the lore, partly because the lore tends to treat its most extreme figures as somewhat beyond the psychology of ordinary people, and partly because the Culexus temple's institutional secrecy means that very little of what the operatives actually experience on a personal level has ever made it into accessible records. But the fragments that do exist suggest something important. The Nemesis novel's portrayal of Iota offers perhaps the most humanizing glimpse available. She is not a straightforwardly sympathetic figure. She is cold, controlled, observational, in a way that can seem detached to the people around her. But she is also clearly aware of herself, aware of her situation, capable of something that functions like preference and something that functions like will, even if the machinery by which she experiences these things is different from the machinery by which a normal person experiences them. She is not a weapon that has forgotten it was ever a person. She is a person who has been shaped into a weapon, and the distinction matters in ways that the narrative acknowledges, even when it does not fully explore. The Black Pariah, Spear, represents the darkest possible version of this same fundamental condition. A blank whose psychological instability was severe enough to make them uncontrollable, who was then abandoned by the organization that created them, who was found and weaponized by the most malevolent forces imaginable. Spear is what happens when the process goes wrong, at every possible level. And the existence of Spear within the lore, as a cautionary counterpoint to operatives like Iota, suggests that the Culexus temple is very much aware of what it is working with, of the fact that it is not creating tools, but reshaping people, and that the margin between a functional operative and a catastrophic failure is maintained by the training and containment protocols of the fortress. Consider also what happens when a Culexus operative completes a mission and is returned to the fortress. The mission has an endpoint. There is a target, and then there is no target, and then the operative is extracted and transported back to the place that holds them. For other Assassin Temple operatives, the period between missions presumably allows some form of recovery, of reorientation, of the integration that comes when a person has done something extreme, and then been given time to process it before the next extreme thing. The lore does not describe this for the Culexus in any detail, but it also does not describe anything that resembles a healthy structure for it. The Culexus returns to the fortress. The null aura, contained again within the animus speculum's dampeners, presses outward at reduced intensity against the psychic landscape of the fortress. The custodian's role ends, at least temporarily. The operative exists in the fortress, among other blanks, in the echoing cold of a place that has no warmth to offer and no pretense of offering any. And then, when the next authorization comes down, and the next target is identified, and the next mission is planned, the process begins again. Whether Culexus operatives accumulate something that might be called the psychological weight of their work, whether the missions leave marks on them in the way that extreme violence leaves marks on soldiers who are not nearly so well conditioned for it, is something the lore does not address. What the lore does suggest, obliquely and through implication rather than direct statement, is that the conditioning the temple provides is designed in part to prevent this accumulation. The cold focus, the purposive detachment, the recontextualization of the null aura as a weapon and a tool rather than a personal condition, all of these are also mechanisms for managing the psychological weight of a life spent killing in the service of an institution that sees you primarily as a resource. Whether those mechanisms work, whether they provide genuine psychological protection, or whether they simply suppress the visible symptoms of damage that accumulates underneath, is one of those questions that the Warhammer 40,000 setting, at its best, poses without answering. The universe is not one in which psychological wholeness is generally available to its most interesting characters. It is one in which people are shaped by their circumstances into functional forms that serve the civilization's survival at whatever cost to the people themselves, and the Culexus assassins are among the most extreme examples of this pattern. There is a particular tragedy in the specific quality of the Culexus's isolation, not the tragedy of being alone, which is a tragedy that many people in many universes share, and which has a kind of dignity to it. Not the tragedy of being misunderstood, which again is common enough to be almost universal in human experience. The tragedy of being fundamentally unable to be close to anyone, not because of anything wrong with your character or your choices, but because the universe has built you in a way that makes closeness impossible. You could be the kindest, most patient, most generous person imaginable. The null aura does not care. It presses against everyone equally. It withdraws everyone equally. It turns every potential connection into the same experience of being separated by a wall that exists not in the space between people, but in the nature of one of them. For the broader Imperium, the existence of blanks raises questions that go to the heart of what the 40,000 setting is about. The Imperium claims to fight for humanity. It claims to protect the people of its million worlds from the horrors of the universe. But its treatment of blanks is, by any honest assessment, an exclusion dressed up as institutionalization. It takes people who cannot be integrated into normal society through no fault of their own, removes them to a distant fortress, uses them as weapons, and maintains the pretense that this is a form of service and honor rather than a form of segregation managed with bureaucratic efficiency. The Culexus Temple does not claim otherwise, at least not internally. The lore does not frame the fortress of the soulless as a place of pride or of belonging. It is exactly what its name says it is, a place for people who have no souls, as the warp measures souls, managed at arm's length by an empire that needs them but cannot entirely bring itself to treat them as fully belonging to the human community it claims to be defending. There is a strange dignity in this, not because the situation is just, it isn't, but because the Culexus operatives who emerge from it, and who operate at the edge of the possible in the Imperium's war against the darkness, are extraordinary by any measure. They exist in a condition that, by all rights, should have destroyed them before they could ever become what they are. They carry a burden, the awareness of their own wrongness, the knowledge of their exclusion, the isolation that never fully lifts even in the middle of a mission that most people would break under entirely. And they do the work anyway, not because they have been given a choice, but because the work is there, and they are the ones who can do it, and the alternative is a galaxy in which the things that prey on human souls do so without anyone capable of reaching back at them through the void and making them stop. There is one more dimension of the Culexus worth considering before we close. The Dictatus Culexus, the official maxim of the temple, reads, "That which is unknown and unseen always commands the greatest fear." This is usually read, and quite reasonably, as a statement about the Culexus's operational approach. They work in secrecy. Their existence is classified. Their deployments are never publicly acknowledged. The enemy never sees them coming. The fear their reputation generates, in the psychers who have heard rumors of what happens to powerful witches who attract the Imperium's attention, is amplified by the fact that the Culexus's existence and capabilities are so thoroughly shrouded in institutional silence that the specifics of what they are remain unknown to most people. But there is another reading. Because the Culexus themselves are unknown and unseen in a more fundamental sense, unknown to the rest of humanity, who do not know they exist and would be deeply uncomfortable if they did. Unseen in the warp, invisible to the vast parallel dimension that the rest of the universe uses as its medium of sight and communication and power. They are the things that the universe itself cannot see. The ones who do not exist in the only dimension that the universe's greatest predators can perceive. And they are feared. The most powerful psychers in the galaxy, beings who can reach across light years with their minds, who can rewrite probability and summon demons and crack planets with their will. These things fear what they cannot see and cannot touch and cannot stop. The Culexus is the darkness that hunts the things that live in darkness, the silence that kills the things that speak with the voice of the warp. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And somewhere at the edge of that war, moving through spaces where the laws of the warp do not reach, carrying a weapon that is their own nature and a burden that is their entire existence, the Culexus assassins do the work that no one else can do. They are not celebrated. They are not well loved. They are not even, in the full philosophical sense, present in the universe in the way that everyone around them is present, but they are there, moving through the gaps between what the warp can see and what it cannot. Walking in the blind spots of entities that have no other blind spots, operating in the silence that they carry with them everywhere they go, that they have always carried, that they were born carrying, that they will carry until the last moment when their own presence in real space ceases, and the void that was always their signature becomes the void that is simply their ending. And the things that should not exist, the daemons and the warlocks and the chaos sorcerers, who believe themselves untouchable because they wield powers that no sword can reach, find at the end that the void has found them anyway. That which is unknown and unseen always commands the greatest fear. That is the maxim of the Culexus temple. It is carved into the stone of the fortress of the soulless. It is the last thing a psyker target feels, not the words, but the truth behind them, the sudden silence where their power used to be, the void approaching through the smoke of their own collapsed defenses. And then, nothing at all. That brings us to the end of this journey through the lore of the Culexus assassins. If you have made it all the way here, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of lore that rewards the time you put into it, and I hope this gave you a fuller picture of one of the most uniquely strange and philosophically rich corners of the 40,000 universe. If you enjoyed this, please do leave a like. It takes about a second, and it genuinely helps this content reach more people who might want to hear about it. If you have not yet subscribed, the button is right there and it costs nothing. And each new video is the kind of deep dive that I think is worth having in your feed. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you thought of the Culexus, whether there's an aspect of their lore you'd want to explore further, whether there's another topic you'd like to see covered next. I read every comment, every one. And I want to know what this community thinks and wants, because you are the reason this exists. Until the next one, stay out of the void.